This week on Inside the Arthouse, we talk about the new documentary Union, having received a special jury award at Sundance and played 30 of the most prestigious doc film festivals around the world. It opens in theaters this week. Through intimate cinema verite, Union chronicles the extraordinary efforts of an unlikely group of warehouse workers as they launch a grassroots union campaign at an Amazon fulfillment center in New York. The filmmakers document the struggle from day one against one of the largest and most powerful companies in the world, offering a gripping human drama about the fight for power and dignity in today's globalized economic landscape. The movie's themes are immediate and timely as we watch the fight for labor rights. It's a David and Goliath story and a release poised to speak to current political conversations. Director Brett Story and Stephen Mang sit down with us to discuss the challenges they faced making Union, the themes they discovered, and the journey to this moment as they prepare for theatrical release later this week. It's a powerful conversation you won't want to miss. Hi, my name is Raphael Sbarge.
And I'm Greg Laemmle.
And we're here in the Royal Theatre.
We're inside the Arthouse.
Inside the Arthouse. And we're here with an important and wonderful film called Union that's about to open in theaters in New York and Los Angeles imminently, and with the two directors who made this film possible. I'm here with Brett Story and Steve Mang, both the co-directors of Union. Thank you for your movie. Thank you for what you've put together. This is really a remarkable piece of work.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I guess this is the first question that I have, which is, you tell a story about this scrappy unionization of Amazon and this journey to do so, which is epic and, again, important. In watching it as a filmmaker as well, I'm also aware of the fact that there's a second movie that went on, which is the making of this movie and the kind of enormous kind of will and determination that it must have taken in order to be able to do it. What was that like? How long did it go on? How did you keep your fortitude, and how did you keep yourself going?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a great question. And it's something that we would actually talk about a lot along the way, because from the very beginning, we understood the film not just as a portrait of a group of people fighting a big corporation, but also a portrait just of a group of people trying to do something really hard that nobody thought that they could do. And there's a way in which a lot of filmmakers have that experience themselves, right? Especially documentary filmmakers who are making a film in which they don't and cannot promise to know what the ending is going to be. We certainly couldn't predict what was going to be the outcome of this election. We just had to persevere. And what that looked like on the ground, and Steve can talk about this more, is just really being, on the ground with this very grassroots, small, scrappy group of worker organizers who basically parked themselves in front of this warehouse in Staten Island, New York, every day and every night for almost a year. And so we followed them over the course of that year, embedded ourselves with them, and then spent a lot of time with them in the many, many months after their victory as well.
Yeah, one of the things that was very similar in terms of experience was that sort of like what Brett's touching on, that, what the workers at JFK and Staten Island were going through was this process of kind of embracing a deep uncertainty about the prospects of their endeavor. And in some ways, the film team, all of us kind of had to kind of come to terms with that feeling too, that, we had no idea if this is a story about a win or a loss or something in between, and what the implications of that might be. At one point, the thought of watching this really inspiring grassroots movement come to life and then witnessing them and documenting them fail felt like a great liability. And so there was a lot in the early months and year of filming that really kind of tested our mettle and made us have to make a commitment to this idea that win or lose, we had to understand this effort on a really much more profound level. Like our intention was to close the distance, this gap of distance of what is visible and not in the contemporary labor movement. And so it was a really exciting, I gotta say, very, harrowing process watching the ALU go through what they did.
Yeah, the ALU being the Amazon Labor Union, which is the center of this movie.
You've both been involved with social justice documentaries, and unfortunately, you've probably seen a share of films that didn't have happy endings. I'm not sure where the question, but yeah, I mean that's just part and parcel of the work, and I guess maybe it's sometimes the struggle itself is the victor. You kind of have to make it that way.
Well, I do think that that's part of the bargain. I mean, I think I certainly feel like anytime I embark on a film, there's always the question, why should this be a film, right? Why? Right. What am I bringing to this as a filmmaker and an artist that a journalist can't do or an activist can't do? What's the power of cinema in telling the story? And part of it is that just the longitudinal, long form and the intimacy of it. We have a chance to use the camera to not just express or follow a set of tactics and, campaign beats along the way and then find out the outcome, but really come to care about a group of people and come to try and understand their motivations. Why does anyone try and do something really, really hard when the odds are against them? And I think that is part of why, it's important to document some of these social issue struggles, even when we can't be promised a happy ending necessarily. That there is, I do think, this value. We understood it from the very beginning, the value and just paying attention to who's on the front lines in our labor struggles, who's on the front lines of our economy, why a group of 8 people who, some of whom are friends, some of whom aren't, would park themselves at a tent at 5 a.m. and try and get a handful of people coming off of a shift to sign election petition cards. Why would they do that? Why would they spend their time doing that? And that's the power of cinema, is that we can develop the kind of intimacy and translate that cinematically via the power of filmmaking.
I think also when you think about some of the films that move us most, they are ones that take us on this kind of a journey that can feel at times transformational, right? That you leave the cinema feeling and differently even about things that you thought you understood. And I think that can come as a result of how a film is structured or how it observes and sees the world. And in our case, it was really kind of like this very profound experience to use cinema verite techniques to be, on the ground level, walking, alongside these organizers as they went through this experience that indelibly changed each and every one of them. And something as well that I think we all were in agreement in our collaboration on our team was this idea that also there's too much emphasis in our culture on individualism, and that this story was much larger than any single protagonist. And we wanted to understand how this was a social organism that was actually doing something and building something that had not actually existed yet in the space of this Amazon warehouse and in the broader space actually of the company at large. So that was, I think that this feeling of as Ricky Leacock talks about, his obsession with the feeling of being somewhere and was very much something that we wanted to make sure that we could impart to.
It must have been so fluid. I mean, it was, history was happening in front of your eyes. You have this wonderful sort of central character, Christian Smalls, at the center. His name is like Willie Loman. It's so iconic, Christian Smalls, a small man taking on a big fight. And then you have these characters around him. How were you as filmmakers able to stay, both as co-directors in sync with one another, and also to know where on the ice, the puck was moving to, so that you could figure out, oh, wait, we got to get over here. Or, we got to, because I could see it being with the weather and with everything else. And I live in New York, so I know how intense those 5 a.m.s can be, particularly out at JFK. How you're dealing with so many elements. How did you figure out? How did you collaborate, and how did you figure out where to point the camera at any given day?
I mean, I think the really great thing about my collaboration with Brett is that we share a lot of very similar political convictions, and as well as aesthetic. I think that there was a real belief that the film needed to kind of interpolate individual and also collective stories. That this idea of of the whole was something that we were trying to understand. What was the dimension of and characteristic of this growing collective movement, and what did the sort of individual transformations that people were going through speak about what was at stake and at hand. And I think structurally also, while there were, of course, with 600 hours of footage filmed over a span of 3 years, there's going to be a lot to sort of discuss and debate. But I think ultimately we always knew, and our larger team of collaborators all always agreed that, we had to be saying something about the systems and structures at hand, simultaneous to the specific story.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about filmmaking being so collaborative is that it becomes really important to have a kind of diversity of perspective while also having a unity of vision. And as Steve said, I think we were so connected and so in sync with each other on the crucial sort of big picture things. And then, Steve was really embedded because he's local, really embedded with the ALU alongside our DP, Martin. And I was sort of in and out of the city. And part of that was, I think, actually to great benefit of the film, because Steve would be really, in the middle of so much detail, and then would call me up and we would talk through what was going on, how that could connect or not connect to the bigger story we were telling. And it's sort of like the relationship one has with their editor or, with their producers, key members. It's really just a kind of people to have conversations with about what you're seeing, how it's making you feel, what it's making you think, what to follow and not follow. And I think this collaboration really benefited from both a kind of sense that we're, as a team, not even just the two of us, but as broader team, really in line with how we understood what this film was about, on a thematic level, and why we were the right people to tell the story, but also a kind of diversity of perspective to get us out of our own heads when sometimes that becomes really hard.
Oh, that really makes sense. I mean, in a way, I can, because it is such a big canvas. The fact that you could have each other as touchstones, and that's such a gift in a way. Because two directors can be complicated, right? But in this case, because it's so, you both come with this passion for the subject and a desire to tell an important story, and how do you tell it? And having someone as a sounding board or each other that's just fantastic. That's fantastic.
It's also just a ton of work, and good to share the work.
A ton of work, right? Absolutely.
Now, a ton of the film is just fly on the wall stuff, and you guys, the camera's there clearly, but there's not direction, and yet that there were also a number of interviews. Were you together on the interviews, or did you discuss the questions that you were going to ask? Or was that also handled sort of separately? Just curious about that process.
It was a mix. So, there were times when Steve would be alone with our protagonist. There would be times when Steve and I would be together filming. There were times when Steve was with our DP Martin. And, I think that, I'm thinking back to some of those interviews in particular, in which, again, they'd happened very organically, I came to sort of rely on Steve's capacity to hold a lot of detail in his brain. And I think that I really enjoy interviews also, and I'm really interested in how to get people, even in that format, to kind of speak to the hardest things and the most challenging things. And I think we had just a really great way of I mean, we would do these interviews, and it would be back and forth, both of us asking questions, and making it really sort of conversational, because we knew that despite the verite form of the film, the observational form of the film, that it's important to get people alone in a kind of more meditative space, which is a different space to express some of their fears or vulnerabilities than sometimes happens in a kind of group context, which is a lot of what we see in the actual film.
Right. And you also did these incredible things where you were there at 5 a.m. or 4 a.m. or 2 a.m. when they woke up. You would be there when they were with their kids. Well, this was when Chris was with his kids and sweeping, being a dad and trying to kind of help them with getting on Zoom school and all that other stuff. Those intimate moments, they're so powerful and they're so illustrative of kind of, again, the humanness of this, because we see them as, you see union leaders as kind of types, or like they're one, in some sense, they serve a purpose. They're an arrow, right? But when you go home with them, or see them in his quiet moments, it really makes it very powerful in terms of kind of really feeling him and feeling both the cost of this and what his drive is, it's the inside.
There was our DP Martin DeCicco actually had a really good way of articulating kind of that tension of what we could observe and what we might miss if we were not to be present. And he called it the fuck it moment, and how important it was to resist that moment where, you've been filming, nothing has happened the last 5 hours, and, you're exhausted. It's midnight and you're about to go home. And when you do, 9 times out of 10, something like astounding takes place, and where you're kicking yourself. There were multiple arrests before the moment when we were able to actually film Chris being arrested by the local police, and Amazon had called on them. That is a perfect example of that moment that you need to actually push through. And, not because we're trying to vacuum up the world, but because in some ways unique to this film, like what they were doing was happening in such easily overlooked fashion, right? That like the banality of sitting at a tent outside of a bus stop, waiting to have maybe a 10 to 30 second conversation with somebody coming or going from the warehouse, could not have seemed more insignificant. And yet there were things that might take place in as banal of a moment as that actually were full of electricity and spoke to kind of the contemporary stakes of what they were dealing with, right? This is a culture of fear that permeated throughout the warehouse for many, many months. They would be flyering and people would just walk by and say, no thanks, no thanks. And, so like there were a lot of examples of how, what we were trying to do was, of course, capture this journey of a complex campaign, and there is a linearity to that, but also bear witness to this very human experience of what it's like for an individual to sort of have very little left to lose, and yet put everything else on the line in order to try and compel a warehouse of 8,000 workers, half of them to vote in favor of a union that has never existed before.
Yeah, and those intimate moments that you talk about where we see Chris at home with his kids and some of the other protagonists at home, I mean, those are just really important because they convey more powerfully than anything we could ever get anyone to say or any statistic we can put on screen what working class life is actually like, right? We can talk about the turnover rate at Amazon. We can talk about the speed up and the time off tasks. But what you really need to see is a person who's exhausted, who's come off a 10-hour shift, who's making all these sacrifices to try and get better working conditions, also go home to a 1-bedroom apartment and help his kids with their homework while also navigating dinner and meetings and getting ready for an early morning shift. And that needs to be conveyed. I mean, I think that that's, part of what we experienced on the ground with this group of people was not just their tenacity and their charisma, which was certainly in abundance, but also just a certain amount of exhaustion. And then to really take seriously what it means to be that exhausted and that wasted by this economy really puts the stakes of their struggle into sharp relief. And it was really important to have those moments.
So that's what I just sort of say, just to underline this, is just to say is, again, it's fucking unbelievable how you stood with it, really. Like, it's astounding, your ability to stay with it just like they did. That's why I sort of say, like, there's almost two films here as you're watching this, because, while you are invisible as filmmakers, just your ability to keep showing up and keep the camera on, as you say, it's astounding what you captured, because you were there. You were there.
Talking about being invisible as filmmakers, I'm curious about the footage inside the facility and how you got that, and obviously the risks that people took to get that footage.
Yeah, I think something that speaks so much to the tenacity and the courage to, I guess, just put it simply, is the fact that these worker turned organizers really took to finding their own tools to capture the workplace adversity and also document what was happening to them. Like, one of the biggest parts of any unionization campaign is to document the violations of labor law that any employer might, either inadvertently or intentionally commit against an organizing group. And so what the workers and organizers of the ALU were doing was documenting as much as they could in order to file what's called an unfair labor practice. And so the cell phone footage was very much a part of that. Of course, in our collaboration with them, there were very, very careful conversations about talking to them about how and if we could utilize some of that footage, and what, growing that relationship and that kind of mutual trust and respect for our individual, but also kind of aligned objectives to kind of document, in a sense, allowed us to gain access to those videos that they were already filming.
And it's worth saying too that the COVID pandemic gave us as a filmmaking team a little gift, which was that pre-pandemic cell phones were not allowed inside the warehouse on shift. Workers were made to put them in their lockers. And it was only as a kind of, give to worker demands. Workers were desperately trying to stay in touch with their families, sick family members at home, keep tabs on everybody when they're being forced as essential workers to go back to work during this pandemic, that the company said, okay, you can bring your phones inside. And that's when you start to see this self-documentation that we then incorporate into the film.
Yeah. It's interesting to think also that, this film and this movement might not have taken hold if not for social media and sort of the current technology, right? I mean, there's this, in a lot of ways, what they're fighting is kind of a war of propaganda, right? That there's this image that Amazon cares very much that they want to be the Earth's greatest employer, right? As they say themselves, and do a lot of messaging to that effect. And, perhaps without cell phone recording available to the workers, and ways to disseminate that on social media, that might not actually be a message you could counter in this moment.
I mean, it's just like the smoke under the door, right? You can't stop it in a way, which is fantastic. I wonder about, perhaps has your life been affected by your having made this film, by being the observers? Clearly, Amazon knows that you made this film. Clearly, they saw you outside the factory.
Clearly, it's not going to be on Prime,
right?
They were smart.
If they were smart.
Sorry.
Yes. Right. Yeah.
It was a joke. I couldn't pass it up.
Yes. We're advocates for movies in theaters, obviously, but in this case, has it affected your lives? Have you felt, have you been followed? Has there been kind of a sense of kind of observation of what you're doing? What's that experience been like?
One thing I'll just share: right after the election victory at JFK 8, Amazon quickly filed an objection to the election results,
Right.
and the ALU's victory, right? So they filed 25 objections. 2 of those made mention of the documentary team and, alleged that the ALU had hired us as kind of like goons to go around and threaten workers to vote in favor of the union and against
You were
Amazon.
a propaganda
Of course,
arm of the union, right? Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So, of course, and, they put a picture of me actually on, in the vicinity of the building, holding the camera. And, of course, that and the other 23 objections were all dismissed. But, it speaks to sort of the determination by corporations that, of this size and power to really avoid unionization, to our own personal safety. The risks that are being taken are all by the organizers and the workers. And yet, one of the messages actually the people who are organizing at Amazon want to disseminate also is that, look, it is very harrowing and uncertain, perhaps, to do this kind of organizing work, but it is within the threshold of capacity and capability to do this, organize, and win. And so people should not be scared, actually. Amazon may try and file complaints against individual workers and organizers, but there is a real strong legal avenue to contest that as well.
You've given the organizers and the movement, in this case, a real flag to rally around in a way, because it is its own. We know that you are both very credentialed filmmakers. You come out of this from a very authentic place, and also it is very much a sort of a flag that the ALU can point to, as relates to bumpy as it may be, and or circuitous as it is determined, and it is it's more than a seed at this point. It's more than just a conversation. It actually has some momentum, and your film has contributed to that. Which is a wonderful thing, obviously, in terms of both unions and as you say, Steve, in terms of reminding people that these things can happen. People can affect change.
Yeah, and I think that this is a moment in which that's more necessary than ever, right? We are at a point in labor history, one of the weakest points in 100 years of labor history. I think union density is something like 6%. And
6%.
It hasn't been. Yeah, it's, and it's been almost 50 years of steady decline in terms of labor density and union density and labor strength. And yet, just in the past couple of years, we've seen a resurgence. And it's a really important resurgence because it's coming precisely out of sectors that traditionally have not been unionized. So it's not the public sector, it's the private sector. So it's these Starbucks stores all over the country, right. Amazon, these aren't coal miners. These are not auto workers. These are not public school teachers even. This is the private sector, an arena deemed unorganizable. This is part of the audacity of what the ALU attempted, is that they were trying to unionize a place that had been deemed by every major union just impossible to unionize. At least right now, Amazon was considered too strong. There was too much turnover. It was too challenging. And I think that part of the reason that Amazon is, in this case, spent millions of dollars hiring union busters and Starbucks stores are getting closed as soon as they unionize, is because there's a recognition that it's not just about these individual workplaces. It's about the contagion effect. It's about a new generation of people who have probably in their own lifetimes never had any experience belonging to a union, but probably haven't even seen their parents belong to a union, right? That's how far we are from a moment of union strength. And so it's actually incredibly powerful to see what can be done, because we're all told that it couldn't be done, and to see people win actual changes in their working conditions. And that contagion effect is really what's threatening, and we're very happy to be part of it. We're really happy to have a film that helps, spread the movement like wildfire, if it can, if we can contribute to that, to to offering a glimpse from the inside of a group of people saying, fuck it, don't tell me I can't do this. I'm going to try and I'm going to prove you wrong. I think that's very inspiring to people. And we're in a moment where, I feel like this, you asked like how we've been affected, and I wasn't really thinking about whether or not I was being followed home from work. I was thinking about how I've just, had my own kind of political courage bolstered by this effort. Like, I feel like I'm a more engaged person in the world. I'm better armed to fight my own despair and be involved in trying to take back my own workplaces and my own, political situation, because I've been so inspired by this group of people, and that's really hard to measure. And it's really exciting to have made a film that can be part of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, this is hopefully going to be a call to consumers. Thinking back to the farm workers strike and, not eating grapes. We have a responsibility. People watching this movie have a responsibility to see the lives of the people that you're portraying, to see the actions of the corporations that's trying to keep them from organizing. And, they're not trying to bring down the corporation. They just want a good job. And how do we respond to that in terms of, I think there's some very important questions there for the audience.
Yeah. And I think that this effort is going to require and going to take people figuring out where they fit in. And it was certainly our aim. And we talked about this all the time. It wasn't about shaming people for being Amazon shoppers. We all do it. There's a convenience to it. Like we live in small towns where the main street has been shuttered. And so Amazon is the only place to buy certain goods. But the point is to remember that on the other side of that purchase is a worker who's left their kid with their grandparents so they could be on the bus at 4 a.m. to get to the job at 7 a.m, and that we all are better off when we support each other's struggles for better working conditions, the right to go home when we're sick, the right to be able to afford rent based on the one full-time job that we have. These aren't hard demands.
No,
yeah, and that, those workers on the other side are in the process of trying to find new models and modes to organize, right? This is a moment that really requires new strategies and new conceptions, because there is this more insidious, more powerful trend now of corporate resistance to labor rights and unionization. We're seeing corporations embracing union busting tactics in a pretty unprecedented level. And so there are so many questions about this idea of like the balance of power between corporations and individual workers that have to be considered in a new way because of companies like Amazon that are now kind of at the center of the economy and have made themselves the center of the labor movement as far as battlegrounds are concerned, that, they are the logistics for delivering all of the goods and products of capitalism, right? And so with that comes a responsibility for them to embrace this conversation that the workers at Amazon's JFK 8, really simply wanted to just activate. This is a conversation. And in a lot of ways, what was so exciting to watch was that at a certain point, it seemed that they knew, this campaign can go either way. And what was important that they continued to stay the course, and that the path would not be an easy one. And they always spoke about that. And so, win or lose, what they were doing was choosing to be this catalyst of change that they needed to see that had not existed yet.
We were talking before we began about, where things are now. And in a way, to me, the power of the movie is less about where things are now and more about this idea of how important it is to be able to stand for the rights of the workers and to hear their voices. So struck with, there they were, the Amazon workers shipping, masks in the throes of the pandemic, and they didn't even have them for themselves as they were basically there moving these packages, and on and on and on. Obviously, there's so many things, and the turnover rate, of course, is an astounding number. There's so many aspects of kind of just basic human rights that should not necessarily be antithetical to the success of a giant company. Personally, as an actor, we spent 6 months on a picket line. It was brutal, and we're all still struggling to kind of get out from under this strike, because the strike has just had concentric circles of impact and just fallout and downdraft. But we were all there again as a labor union. In this case, we were a union. We are a union. We are, and we were collaborating with other unions, writers' unions, to stand for basic principles of let us do our job. We are not machines. We are not technology. We are not robots. We are not AI. We are actually people who bring a human element to this transaction. And so somehow, again, what your film does is it stops us for a moment to kind of remind us when we click, to get that thing, whatever that thing is, what that's connected to and who's involved and what that means, and not, as you say, which I appreciate, because I was going to ask you, Brett, about, do you still use Amazon, right? It is the big question. I guess, I imagine you get that, but it's not to say, well, we're going to boycott Amazon. That's not the intent of this movie remotely. But it's really about trying to understand how do we all work together so that the humans that make that power it can still be considered as we continue to sort of allow this enormous potential benefit for all to still persevere.
Yeah, I'm so glad you connected the writers' strike and the SAG after strike to our film, because we see them as not only part of the same struggle because they're all labor struggles, but also many of the conditions that writers and actors were describing are not, they're different than the essential workers working in a warehouse as a picker but some of the dynamics that have led to those degradation of conditions are similar, right? It's like about the consolidation of big media and tech companies that are answering to shareholders about their profits and trying to run themselves as lean and efficiently as possible. And in so doing, cutting corners and squeezing people, right? Squeezing people out, and sometimes out entirely. I mean, there was a piece in the New York Times just a couple of days ago about editors in Hollywood.
Terrible.
Yeah, right? Being replaced by AI. I mean, there's so many affronts. There's an artistic affront, like really the magic of the human imagination and all of that skill and talent that goes into developing our craft can just be replaced by machines. And we think we're going to get the same kind of like magical, entertainment and artistic experience out of our television. I think, we can call bullshit on that, but also just absolutely just this right to, the right to work well, to be healthy while we work, to make a living, to feel like our job is satisfying. I mean, I think that's one of the really interesting differences too, between, thinking about who makes up our labor force now. Amazon is the second largest private employer in America. And this is a very different workplace than, again, the coal miners and the auto workers were dealing with in the 60s, at the heyday of those economies. I mean, they're hard, they're taxing, they're punishing on the body, and all in similar in all of those ways. But the difference is that Amazon workers are being told that they're disposable, that they're not expected to feel any dignity in their work. And that's a real affront. And I think it's really important to connect workers who maybe are discouraged about thinking themselves as workers because they do find dignity in their work, like editors and actors and documentary filmmakers, who are passionate and feel a kind of identification with the work, and to be reminded, no, we might feel that, and that's a benefit of the work, but that doesn't mean we also don't have a a boss who's leveraging their power to make us more and more precarious, and that is undermining our capacity to have a good life. And joining, this is again the joy of being part of making a movie in a moment of resurgent labor struggle across lots of different sectors, is that the part of the contagion effect is just the joy of being on a picket line. It might be hard, but it's actually like, I hope you experience this. It's really beautiful to feel like you have peers and colleagues that have a shared purpose, and that you're on the right side of a struggle, and to be out there together, doing something together, not to be alone in your despair, but be together, fighting the right fight. And I think that can't be bottled, and that can't be dismissed. And even in our film, it was a smaller scene of people, but that's what they found at the tent. It wasn't just the righteousness of their struggle, but the camaraderie of being with a group of people that also felt that shared sense of purpose.
I want to just add also that, like the workers at Amazon in particular, like they don't want to shut down the corporation at large, right? Like they want jobs. They just want better jobs, and they want the public to talk about this disconnect, right? Corporations are making profits at unprecedented levels, right? This idea that a worker's safety and survival does not matter anymore across so many labor sectors is creating this palpable anger and frustration. Not just in Staten Island, but across the country, right? And that does tie into all of the kind of like labor resurgence that we were seeing. The year of their victory, there were about 500,000 workers that went on strike. I think it was about 350 strike actions, which was 8 times more than the previous year in 2021. And so that kind of does capture this idea that like we've both been in a decline of union density, but there is this very uncorked kind of anger and indignance to the corporate takeover of people's basic ability to survive. And so I think this idea that, the individual indignation of any worker, when that is put into context of a group and a collective, that is a very threatening prospect that leads to very viable strike actions. So I think while we, the message of their movement was not always just simply to boycott Amazon per se, there will come a time when they are very close to negotiating a contract, and they will want to exercise and demonstrate that strength that, as a collective group of workers and organizers, they are able to economically impact the company. And so there may be a moment where consumers do need to consider boycotting. But I think it's, it just calls upon us to really pay closer attention, at the very least, to the organizing that's happening.
It reminds me of something you mentioned earlier, Brett, and for my own edification, for the edification of the audience, where do you draw a line between being a documentarian or a journalist, or in some respects, I don't want, but not propaganda, but having an opinion about what's happening and expressing that and putting that into film?
Yeah, I don't know if you can draw a line. I mean, I think for me personally, anyways, the move is to be honest and to be honest with audiences. So for us, we certainly have strong opinions. You can feel the political point of view of the filmmakers while you watch the film. I don't think it's disguised, but we also don't see the film as a piece of propaganda or even just simple messaging. We lean into what we're learning from what we're watching, so we're not just there to just say what we think, but also learn from this extraordinary privilege we have of being witness to this struggle, and lean into the stuff that was most challenging. I mean, this is why when you see the film, it is not a glossy picture of like righteous activists who 100% easily reign victorious over a big company. There is some of that, but this is a portrait of people with flaws and with insecurities and real differences, trying to do something together in a world that doesn't much encourage us to do anything together, and does encourage us all to feel like we're in constant competition with each other. And so we as a film team have a political point of view, but we do also respect some of the basic tenets of journalism, which is be factual, ask important critical questions, think carefully about what an audience needs to understand in order to be informed, and activated participants in our world. And I think that's what's crucial about having good journalism and making sure that we have robust journalism. It's why it's so necessary to democracy, and documentary film is certainly part of that, but it's not about pretending that there's some sort of objective, position or neutral position. We are led by our passions and our convictions as much as anyone else.
There's no question where you point your camera has a sort of an impact, and that obviously opens up bigger questions. And this is sort of a philosophical question, but I mean, or maybe just an observation, but we are in an age of technology, right? Technology leads our lives, whether it be through the little devices we carry around or how we interact with the world. Amazon is another sort of profound iteration of that, which became more sort of dynamically a part of our everyday with COVID, et cetera. And somehow, and this is the interesting thing, technology has essentially severed some kind of any connection to a human element, and what were sort of family businesses or essentially, companies where people could work for years or generations. There was always so much more of an awareness of a human element. And it's interesting. And again, you don't speak to this directly. This is when people who see your movie get to go to a coffee shop afterwards and discuss this. But where did we lose that thread where essentially the human element, where you have to fight for such basic needs, where things, are not considered. And if they are, it's seemingly somehow anti-capitalistic, expansion, trying to essentially undermine, the engine of the economy. It's such a sort of a frustrating kind of, the way it's been set up is so either or, and it shouldn't be either or. It should be and, do you know what I mean? Mutual benefit. But it's fascinating that we live in a time where that has been severed. And again, you speak to that, and you show that, as you say, by the doubts and the questions and the confusions and the determination, et cetera. That's more of an observation, but I don't know if you want to take that and sort of respond to that.
I mean, it raises such a fascinating idea. I think that it undergirds all of this, right? That the kind of like layer and the moment of technology that we are seeing within work sectors is creating this kind of like, it helps propagate this illusion that, there's no working class, right? That workers at a place like Amazon are part of a growing, thriving, upwardly mobile middle class, and yet actually all of these layers of technology are, positioned to push real, meaningful human labor out in order to put in unneeded, create unneeded jobs, right? There's such a crazy kind of phenomenon now that like there are so many new contemporary jobs that are kind of like pointless, would be unimaginable 15 years ago, right? That the way that social media is managed by a corporation like Amazon, for instance, right? That entire jobs and departments fixated on just the messaging that goes out and the dissemination of that. These illusions about like where you will be positioned if you take a job, what opportunities you will have, the kind of free education that you will retain. I think that there's, we can track all of that back to this technological moment that is actually only aiding and abetting a kind of always like an ever-present interest in class control by this corporate, elite. So I think that there's so much to talk about there, and probably for another podcast.
Yeah, no, I mean,
another film.
These are the issues
the whole film
you speak to. I guess that pivots into the timing of your release of this as we walk into this epic election. And again, there's no politics with what you're doing. You're outside of it, but you can't not be aware. The fact is that you're going to land into the class 5 tsunami that we're all in with a political discussion that shows a vivid contrast between worker and non-worker thinking, I guess. I don't know. Do you want to? What's to be said about that?
There's so much to be said. In a way, I think the thing that I am very interested in right now, observing not just the American election, but elections all over the world. I think this is a year with like more elections than there's been in decades in a single year. And what we're facing in the U.S. is similar to what many countries are facing, which is increasing presence of the far right, which I think relates in no small part to feelings of political despair and emotional despair and just a bit of hopelessness about the state of the world. So, there's obviously lots of policy ways that our film connects. We can talk about the PRO Act, we can talk about the National Labor Relations Board, but I think there's also just an important theme of, fighting disillusionment, thinking about ways in which to not feel like the powers that be are so much larger and stronger than us that there's no point even participating, and you might as well just like stay on the internet all day and read conspiracy theories. I mean, I think that it's a part of remembering that there's a joy and also a purpose to taking back power again. I mean, that's what the ALU demonstrated, that they weren't going to sit by and let this company just have all this total power over their lives, including the power of life and death, which is what happened during the pandemic. And I think that that's, hopefully not overstating things too much, but that's what's, to my mind, what's at stake in this election as well, is, whether or not we believe this world is worth fighting for, or we're going to sort of give in to the kind of despair and narratives of loathing of others that comes with that despair. I mean, I think the Republican Party, personally, I think the Republican Party at this point is a party that's a toxic party that's all about activating people's frustration, anger, sadness, and pointing it at others and saying they're to blame. And I think there's a lot at stake in fighting against that.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can see so much of like what unfolded in Staten Island as almost like a microcosm of the American political landscape.
Yes.
Right? That this kind of like weaponization of worker grievance, right, to actually combat the collectivization of workers in their attempt to address the real problems of survival that are the source of that grievance. So there's so much about who controls the message being the victor, and something needs to cut through that. And we can't even settle on ever any common set of facts that we can say, well, these are immutable. Let's debate. Right? There's no baseline to any political conversation at this moment, right. And that's one of the most disturbing things about trying to have cogent conversations. And so something that was really, I think also fascinating and notable about the ALU is that they really tried to move through this this problem in the most humanistic way, right? They understood that look, they weren't there as political agents. It was, they understood that the best way to reach a fellow worker was not to ask them about these top line, issues. It's like approaching a neighbor that you don't share the same political conviction with and asking them about their dog before you ask them about their political voting history.
Who they're voting for, right.
They understood that, yeah, if you could connect that, they could just connect with a fellow worker and understand deeply and profoundly what was bothering them, and if there was any way to help, that would begin a conversation that had not existed yet and would be a meaningful start to a coalition that they were trying to create.
Yeah, and maybe I'll just jump in with one last point. Speaking of coalition, is like this. I think the film makes this really clear. The ALU is a multiracial, Black-led and multiracial group of working class people that are taking on this struggle. And I think that like when in the sort of political discourse and punditry we talk about white working class, we erase the fact that it's Black and brown people, many immigrants that are on the front lines of many of these jobs. But they're also working in coalition with other working people of many different statuses and many different races. And that's where people's power lies. And I think it was really important to bear witness to the challenges and opportunities of working in multiracial coalition and for this group of people just doing that work day in and day out. Because again, if you just believe what the politicians say, it's impossible. We're all pitted against each other. And I just think on the ground, that's absolutely not true, but we need to see evidence of that.
Yeah.
And also that if you think back, right, in 1935, what the ALU did was unprecedented also even within the labor movement, because in 1935, when the National Labor Relations Act was put into effect, which was this incredible moment as part of the New Deal reforms, where workers could now legally organize and bargain contracts with their employers. A great boon and victory, but yet agricultural workers, domestic workers were not part of that. They were not included. And who were those workers? They were Black Americans. They were Black female Americans. And so from its very onset, the labor movement was siloed by race, by gender, of course, by class. And what we're seeing now, many years later, is a worker-led movement that is very cognizant of that and cognizant of the fact that our voices need to be important and foregrounded. And we need to define a new relationship with these traditional legacy unions that have operated in a certain way. Like the head of the Teamsters showing up at the RNC in such a politicized manner.
Is such a great moment, right? Political theater.
Raises a lot of questions.
Yeah. I mean, we're not we can talk about our great history of American labor history. There's some skeletons in that closet.
Exactly.
You've both made a number of films before this one. This is probably I think maybe the first one that's getting a significant theatrical release. Any comment or feelings about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, my last feature doc, Crime and Punishment, we did a pretty broad theatrical release, so that was exciting to see. I think it's like just in a short number of years, though, the distribution landscape has shifted so dramatically. We've just seen this narrowing of what studios and streamers want to define as watchable content, right? It's like if it's not true crime, sports, or celebrity, the algorithms and the data alleges that it's not something that people want to watch. And yet what we've been seeing, at least, on the festival circuit is like this incredible energy and feedback and interest in the film. And in our work behind the scenes, we have identified countless communities, regions, viewers, potential viewing audiences that continuously are asking us, how do we get the film? How do we watch it? What's next? So Brett can talk more about the release.
I mean, you obviously you played Sundance, and you were clearly given an amazing sort of opportunity to kind of really set yourself out there. You then, I know you were at Tribeca recently. I missed it there. I was by a day. I wanted to see it there in the theater, but you had to make a decision at some point. Do you open this theatrically? or do you take a streaming deal? And you decided or opted for a theatrical window, which is, our personal bias. It's the reason why I asked this. Here, as we sit in this theater with a theater owner and a movie lover, we're both movie lovers, but movies in theaters are important to us. And so it's interesting for a film. Sorry, I'm just giving you this more information. This film, which is, as you say, might more readily, it's a small, interesting doc about a big subject, and will people come to theaters to see it? And so you had to sort of pivot on that, obviously, at some point. And so I'm really curious what your decision was, because I celebrate the fact that this is opening in theaters.
Well, we love movie theaters, so there's that. We're filmmakers who always imagine our films as belonging not just on a big screen. We pay a lot of attention to the craft, the sound, the music. It's meant to be experienced as a full, almost physical experience, and that's the magic of being in a movie theater, but also as a communal experience. I mean, I think you named it earlier when you said, well, and then that's something people can go and talk about afterwards at the coffee shop. Well, precisely, right? You watch something alone at home, and that's one particular kind of experience. But when you go to a movie theater, you can hear when other people laugh. You can hear when other people hold their breath. When someone else sobs, there is a feeling that you belong to society, that you belong in a world that's different, and I would argue only available when you go see something in the theater. And for this film in particular, which is so much about defying isolation, rejecting the isolation that even our workplaces put us in. These are workers that can't even talk to a manager. They're being told if they're fired or if they're being reprimanded through an app on their phone. And that experience of total alienation, especially during something as terrifying as a pandemic, is the last straw for them. And what they wanted and what they needed is to feel like they belong to something, to an organism where other people have their back. And the organizing took place in part because workers are showing up to a workplace and saying, how are you? How's your mom? What happened with the knee surgery the other day? Checking in on each other. And so for us, there's just a real one-to-one between the subject of this film and the experience of going out of your house, somewhere where there's other people, maybe going with a friend, but also seeing strangers, people who are a different age than you, people from a different neighborhood than you, experiencing something together, and then maybe going out afterwards and talking about it or thinking about it or checking in with the 5 people you also know have had that experience. That brings us together in this way that I think is really crucial, as well as just being fun. I think we've been talking a lot about serious politics, but we hope that the film is experienced as fun as well. There's some there's some funny moments. There's some very emotional moments, and it's like
certainly some uplifting moments.
An event.
Yeah.
There's no question.
So you're opening. We'll be at the theater. You'll be at the IFC Center in New York when the film opens on October 18th.
October 18th, yeah.
Hopefully you'll be in LA when we open on October 25th. I had the experience of going around the country to screenings of only in theaters. I don't know how much travel you'll be able to do with the film, but check your local Arthouse listings and you'll see where the film is playing and hopefully have a chance to talk to Brett and Steve in person.
Yeah, I love what you said, just that the theme of the film resonates with your desire as a filmmaker to actually make contact, to actually have a physical, I talk about how we come into a real estate designed for the viewing experience. We come in as strangers and we leave as friends because we have this shared experience, right? Just the opportunity. We're social animals, and the opportunity to be in a singular space together is so important. But that actually connects to some of the theme of the film. I love that, and I'm so glad you made the decision, both of you, to kind of put this in theaters, because I seeing it on a big screen and really experiencing that way is so important. It's so important and so much more impactful, I think.
I think what's really kind of core to the work that we did on this is that, this is it's a social practice art, right? This kind of cinema that we went in, we spent 3 years with this group of worker organizers and have continued to have a relationship with them and continue to engage them in understanding what is the best way we can release this film as well, and with tapping into their knowledge of the workers across the country at Amazon's and also other organizations beyond. So in a lot of ways, like the thing that I like about what we were able to pull off with this film is that it's not just documentary journalism. It's not just an account of a thing that unfolded, but that there are many kind of like impressionistic and expressionistic elements to it that create ambiguity, that really invite the viewer to have their own experience and find their own conclusions in these moments that are not prescriptive, right? Like our role as filmmakers was to be very much kind of like the silent narrator, but give a kind of window for people to see something refracted and reflected onto themselves or within themselves. And so, as Brett is describing, right, I think like that experience of being with other people physically just helps that experience, right? It allows people to remember more easily, like, oh, we are experiencing something not totally dissimilar to what is unfolding, even if you're not an Amazon worker in Staten Island. And so I love the experience of seeing this film with other people whenever we have the opportunity to in theaters, and doing a theatrical run was incredibly important to us. I want to also clarify that a interesting thing happened as we were seeking distribution for this film was, and I think, there's been a little bit that's been written about it, and we'll be talking about it more in the coming months. But the distributors all embraced it and responded with such glowing kind of feedback, saying how much they loved it. And in so many cases, there was this is a tough film for us at this moment. It's hard to get into, or we love this film. We want to work with you. There's some complications here. And there were often very cryptic responses. And I think that it's no secret that every industry, including the entertainment and documentary field, has
deep connections with corporate
issues or potential issues that maybe the heads of these organizations might not want to excite. Perhaps we don't know. We can only speculate. But
I'm thinking back to the experience of Super Size Me, where this is clearly a film that audiences want to see and will embrace, and yet distributors didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. Why? Well, we don't know.
At the same time, that's not unique to our film, right? Like, no. I had heard a couple months ago that only 10 or 12 films since January had gotten distribution deals, which, I hope somebody can vet out whether that's true or not. But that we are sitting in a moment where every filmmaker, whether you've spent, 5 years or 5 months making your film, is looking at a very existential kind of decision that either you understand this changing landscape and how we create new modes of distributing and getting the film out to audiences who very much want to see this work, or films, will be relegated to some level of obscurity because of what these large, consolidated corporations want to define as viewable content.
That's just, thank you for that answer. I so appreciate what you said, and it's so true as a rallying cry to filmmakers as well, right? And sorry, this is my own personal soapbox now. I mean, we're here, Greg and I, making this because we feel so strongly about movie theaters, and movie theaters, as we know, have been struggling, and because of the pandemic, that little pandemic thing, but B, because people have gotten out of the habit of going. People don't remember that actually there's an experience of seeing a movie, not just ingesting the burger. You know what I mean? It's just, you to actually have a thing that can actually, in that space, transform you, reorient your DNA in a theater. And so you saying that is so, I think, a rallying cry to other filmmakers as well, and to know that how important it is for us to be able to be in theaters. It is how the medium was designed, right? We're seeing you on this giant screen, albeit Zoom, but you're on a giant screen in this theater, and it even that is it's very powerful sitting here with you with your enormous images there, and it is. I have a lot of filmmakers who've got a lot of films on hard drives, and I don't think that a film actually feels like a film until it actually impacts an audience in a space that is essentially dedicated to that. And so we, both as audience members and as filmmakers who had to face the decision you made, which is, yes, it's a changing landscape, but yes, it's important to be able to kind of get out there and put ourselves out in theaters. We want to do everything we can to support that, and because this is an important film, and people should see it, and they should see it in theaters. If they miss it, they can always see it all those other places. But this is a movie to be seen in the theater because it takes you on a journey, and it really does affect you deeply by the end of it. Cumulatively, the time and the journey and the pain and the humor and the just the determination of it really sort of creates something that's very meaningful and important and timely.
Thank you. Yeah, we're thrilled. I hope everybody comes and checks out the film. It's going to be going to many, many cities in October and in other countries as well in November. And we're going to have special guests at many of these screenings as well. So extra incentive to come out.
That's just fantastic.
Where can people go for information?
Unionthefilm.com is a great place to start. Also Union the Film on Instagram.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you for the conversation. I mean, it's a cool conversation. It's really great to talk to both of you. Thank you for your work. Thank you for making this movie. And we just, as they say, Godspeed as you take it out. We're very excited about that.
Oh, thanks so much for giving us this opportunity to chat more, and for having us in your beautiful theater, and for keeping the flame of movie-going alive. It's been really fun to talk to you, so thank you.
Inside the Arthouse was produced by Miles McCreary, Thomas Cassetta, and Raphael Sbarge, and our on-site producer is Noreen Dickerson, and filmed at the Laemmle Royal Theatre. The episode was edited by Gabriel Laemmle, show open edited by Rick Pratt, music by Isabel Engman and Gerardo Garcia Jr., graphics by Janet DeAngelis, marketing by Stephanie Peters and Matthew King. Find out more at InsideTheArthouse.com.